Good morning. Today we are visiting Andersonville, Georgia, the site of Camp Sumter, one of the most notorious Confederate prisoner of war camps of the American Civil War. It existed for 14 months from about February of 1864 until April of 1865, when the war ended. Behind here you see the expanse of the camp, as well as some monuments that have been erected by various states who had people who lived here and hopefully survived here or died here. Inside this little iron fence you see the remains of what was an attempted escape tunnel dug by the prisoners to try to get out of the camp. There were several tunnels built, this one included, but they weren't all that successful. Of the 40,000 some people who were here over the course of the fort's existence, only 300 and some are known to have escaped, and not all of them through tunnels. Here we have the remains of one such attempted tunnel. This big monument was erected by the state of Wisconsin in honor of the Wisconsin soldiers who died here, believed to have been 378 in number. There are several other monuments around here erected by various states, but I'm not going to stop at each one and elaborate on each one. Up on the hill here you see a reproduction of the North Gate. Prisoners would arrive usually by railroad at the train station in nearby Andersonville town, and then they would march up here to the North Gate of the camp, where they would be brought inside and let their fate await them. Here's another view of the North Gate to the Stockade. I could walk up there, but I'm not going to. On August 14th, 1864, there was a big thunderstorm here, and the water from the rainstorm filled the Stockade Creek over here and provided the prisoners with some much needed fresh water. It is also said that during this same storm there was a lightning strike that hit part of the stockade, and it caused a spring to open up in the ground, providing even more fresh water. They called it Providence Spring because the prisoners felt that the spring coming up all of a sudden was an act of God answering their prayers. This building was built in the early 1900s to commemorate the spring. After the war, there was an organization for Northern veterans called the Grand Army of the Republic. It was sort of like a American Legion of sorts for Civil War soldiers and veterans. This pavilion was built by the Women's Auxiliary of the Grand Army Republic in 1901. The little bridge you see down here crosses the upstream end of Stockade Branch. This was supposed to be the clean water end of the branch. Branch would go right through the camp all the way to the far end there, and that's where the latrines, or the sinks as they were called, would be located. So in theory you'd have the clean water at the upstream end and the dirty water at the downstream end. Unfortunately, it didn't quite work out that way, because here, this area to the left is where the camp bakehouse as well as the quarters for the guards were located. And so the water in the creek, you had runoff from the guards and you had runoff from the bakehouse, so the water was already polluted before it even got into the camp. Now, all along the perimeter of the camp, you'll see these little concrete posts that say stockade and deadline. Now, the ones illustrating the word stockade were the fence post line of where the stockade walls actually were located. They go all the way around the camp up here. Now, about 20 feet inside the stockade was a small, crudely built fence called the deadline. And this was there to keep the prisoners from getting anywhere close to the walls, as if to effect an escape. And the rules were that if a prisoner crossed the deadline and got into this no man's zone between the deadline and the stockade, he would be shot. And that rule was very strictly enforced. Now, these two stone pillars here are marked the what was the entrance to the south gate. The prisoners would come in on the north gate, and those who died would be taken out on the south gate and laid along the ground here until the wagons could come and take them over to the cemetery and bury them. Now, if you look closely, you can see a single white post sitting out here in the middle of the camp. Gangs are nothing new for prisons. There were gangs back in the Civil War days as well. The biggest gang here at Andersonville were about 200 men called the Raiders. And they would typically brutalize the other prisoners. When new prisoners came in, or fresh fish as they called them, they would pretend to make friends with the new guys to kind of help them let their guard down a little bit, and then they'd rob them of everything they owned just about. Well, this didn't last too long, because another group of prisoners called the Regulators sort of formed their own little police force with the consent of Commandant Henry Wirtz. Eventually, the 6 ringleaders of the Raiders were rounded up and actually put on trial, again with the authorization of the camp commandant. The 6 ringleaders were found guilty of murder, mayhem, theft, and other bad things, and they were all sentenced to death. Now, right there where you see that single white post, that's where a gallows was erected, and they were all hanged. This little area is called Star Fort. It is one of several earthworks fortifications that were built at each corner of the camp. In 1864, when Union General Sherman started his march through Georgia, there was concern that Sherman's army might come by here and try to free all the prisoners. So the Confederates hastily built all these little earthen forts at each corner of this compound, so they would have a defensive fortification if and when Sherman's army came by. But Sherman's army never came by, so they never really got much use. This field up here was located was a hospital site, located outside the fort. Many of the sick prisoners were taken there, and fortunately many of them died. Farther over this way, there was another hospital site. The first hospital, I think, was inside the fortress. The second two were built outside. You can see from this vantage point pretty much the entire area of the fort. You'll see at the crossroads here how the white pillars for the stockade and the deadline turn and go on down this way and then turn again and head up the following hill. In the distance you can see another one of the earthworks that was built as a fortification. On the far end we can see a reproduction of the stockade. We'll go visit there in a minute. But this is the downstream end of Stockade Branch, where all the latrines or sinks, as they call them, were built. Problem was that the stockade fence right here ran right across the branch and sort of made like a little dam that caused the water to back up somewhat, but it wasn't a nice pond, it was a swamp. Of course, with swamp comes things like malaria and more disease and other bad things. This is a reproduction of the stockade wall that sits the northeast corner of the camp. It's typical of how they were built, although you can see the logs used today look like they've been processed and pressure treated and everything else to preserve them for future enjoyment. The original logs, though, were just rough-hewn trees with the bark still on them and everything else. Each was cut to about 20 feet in length, and a 5-foot trench was dug in the ground to plant them and then filled back in to form the wall. This is one of many guard towers that were around the stockade, or a pigeon roost as they were called. Here's an inside view of the stockade wall. You can see the deadline fence all around the inside of it there, as well as some examples of the kind of structures the prisoners built to try to live in. So there were no tents, there were no barracks. They had to make do with what they had. They would use blankets, pieces of clothing, anything they could find to make a little hovel for themselves to live in. Often they would dig holes in the ground underneath their so-called tents to give them a little bit more space. Here's a view of pretty much the whole camp. You can see the road down there was just outside where the original stockade was. Give you an idea how big this place was. And though it looks big, there's really not a lot of room to accommodate all the prisoners that were held here. This is Andersonville National Cemetery. Here you can see the stones of the 13,000 and some soldiers who died here. Now, originally, these were all buried in trench graves with only a small marker indicating their number, that is, the number in which order in which they died. Now, there was a Union soldier who worked in the camp hospital who secretly kept a list of the names of all the soldiers that died and in the order that they died. And after the war, thanks to his record keeping, they were able to identify, cross-referencing the number with the name, and identify the location of each soldier's burial and erect for him a proper stone with their name. Now, Andersonville National Cemetery is still an active cemetery, and it is still accepting interments of those who are authorized to be buried here. Here you can see a number of stones of some of the more recent burials. The only requirement is that the person must have been on active duty for more than 180 days and be discharged under non-dishonorable conditions. Their spouses and their minor children can be buried with them. Earlier I talked about a gang called the Raiders and how their 6 ringleaders were all rounded up, put on trial, and ultimately hanged for their crimes. These are the graves of the 6 Raiders who were hanged. They had to put them here, but they chose to keep them separate from the rest of the prisoners who had died more honorably. But this is a monument to former American prisoners of war who were held at the German prisoner of war camp Stalag 17B in Austria. It just so happens I had a great uncle who fought in World War II. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge, and he spent a little bit of his time, actually his whole time, as a prisoner in Stalag 17B until 1945, when he and his fellow prisoners were able to escape. Now, my uncle's not buried here, but this is a monument to him and the other prisoners who were held there. And that pretty much concludes our visit to Andersonville National Historic Site and the Andersonville National Cemetery. Hope you enjoyed watching the video as much as I enjoyed making it. Don't forget to hit the like button, and better yet, subscribe to my channel. And I'll see you on the next adventure. Bye.